Hello, Britlet. This is the Jane Eyre discussion for chapters 26 and 27, and a lot happened. So you should be listening to this on Monday, April 20th, and at the end I'm also going to explain a little bit more about your written assignment that you need to submit tonight by midnight. That's Monday, April 20th by midnight. It's for a classwork grade. You know, the question checks are homework grades, so that's going to be a classwork grade. So you're going to want to make sure that you do a good job on that, okay? And I'll explain it fully. So let's get into the chapters. Okay, so it starts out with chapter 26, and it is finally the day of their wedding. And I asked you, what does Mr. Rochester's mood seem to be the morning of their wedding, and does that seem odd? Because if you remember, he's really just kind of like rushing Jane a whole lot. You know, she's trying to get ready, and he's yelling up the stairs like, hurry up. And then when he gets her in the breakfast room, he's like, I'll give you 10 minutes to eat. And then we're heading to the church, and he's sending servants to go and make sure everything's ready at the church. And he says the moment they return, they got to have the carriage ready because they're going to head straight to London and then to travel. And so he's just rushing. And he finally gets her to the church gate, and he stops because he realizes she's out of breath. And he's like, oh, I'm sorry, I'm being cruel in my love. Delay an instant, lean on me. And so she's kind of like catching her breath, and she sees, I don't know if you noticed this, because it didn't seem to be important at the time, but now that we've read the chapter, she sees two figures of strangers straying amongst the low hillocks and reading the mementos graven on the few mossy headstones. I noticed them because as they saw us, they passed around to the back of the church. So now we know, of course, that was Bertha's brother, Richard Mason, and that was the lawyer, but Mr. Briggs. But at the time, we didn't know who that was. So anyway, she saw him go in the side door of the church, and she realizes they're probably going to, just like see the wedding or whatever. There's nobody invited to the wedding. And that was that part about the two strangers. So the two strangers, again, are Richard Mason, who, remember, has visited Thornfield before. That's the one who scared Rochester so badly, and the one who got bitten and stabbed. And then Mr. Briggs, who is a lawyer. Okay, so they go into the ceremony. There's not any kind of people there. It's just to be Jane and Rochester and one witness and the preacher. That's all that's going to be there. And so, they'll see everybody else when they get back from the church. And that wasn't completely unusual for that time. There would be, people invited to, a party afterwards. But you didn't necessarily have people invited to the actual ceremony. So anyway, the wedding ceremony has begun. And it gets to the part in the service where the preacher says, I require and charge you both, as you will answer at the dreadful day of judgment, when the secret of all hearts shall be disclosed, that if either of you know any impediment, why you may not lawfully be joined together in matrimony, you do now confess it. For you will be well assured that so many as are coupled together otherwise than God's word doth allow are not joined together by God. Neither is their matrimony lawful. So he pauses just for a minute like they do. And so basically that's the part, to put it in more modern terms, that's where they say, does anybody object to this wedding or anything like that? Does anybody have any objections? So at that point, before the preacher can proceed, all of a sudden they hear a voice from the back of the church say, the marriage cannot go on. I declare the existence of an impediment. And of course, an impediment is something that means it's going to stop it, right? And Rochester says proceed and tries to get the preacher to continue. And the preacher's like, I can't proceed. I have to investigate. Somebody just said there's an impediment. So, that was very odd. And so the person from the back of the church, and we know later it's Mr. Briggs, says the ceremony is quite broken off. I'm in a condition to prove my allegation. An insuperable impediment to this marriage exists. In other words, an impediment that there's no way around. You can't get over it. You can't get past it. And so Mr. Rochester's not reacting. He's not turning around. He just holds Jane even closer to him. And he says, well, what is it supposed to be? And who are you? And so the guy introduces himself. He says he is Briggs, and he's a solicitor, which means lawyer, from London. And he says that Mr. Rochester has a wife who is now living. And so he said, you're going to thrust on me a wife? So in other words, he tries to make it sound like Mr. Briggs is making it up. And he says, no, I'm just going to remind you of the lady's existence. And so he says, well, tell me who this wife is supposed to be. And so he produces the marriage certificate, the marriage license, and says, and in addition to that, it says, I affirm and can prove that on the 20th of October, from a date of 15 years back, Edward Fairfax Rochester of Thornfield Hall in the county of Blank and of Ferndean Manor in Blankshire, England, was married to my sister Bertha Antoinetta Mason, daughter of Jonas Mason, merchant, and of Antoinetta, his wife, a Creole, at Blank Church, Spanish Town, Jamaica. The record of the marriage will be found in the register of that church. A copy of it is now in my possession, signed Richard Mason. So it's a letter from Richard Mason saying that, Rochester is married to his sister. And so Rochester says, well, that proves that I was married, but it doesn't prove that she's still living. And the lawyer said, well, she was living 3 months ago. And he said, how do you know? And he says, I have a witness. And he said, well, produce him or go to hell. And he says, I'll produce him first. He's on the spot. And so he calls Mr. Mason forward. Mr. Mason looks, scared, and Rochester kind of like bows up at him, and he shrinks back and is like, good God, And so finally Rochester says, what do you have to say? And the clergyman, the preacher, says, you have to say whatever it is you're going to say. And Richard Mason says that his sister, Rochester's wife, Bertha, is now living at Thornfield Hall. He said, I saw her there last April. I am her brother. So, mystery solved. Huge mystery solved, right? And of course, we have more revelations that occur through the rest of this chapter and into the next chapter. But that's who bit Mr. Mason and tried to burn Rochester in his bed and tore up Jane's veil and has the creepy laugh. It's not Grace Poole. Grace Poole was hired to basically be her guard and her keeper. It's Bertha Mason, Rochester's crazy lunatic wife, who he keeps locked up in the attic apparently for her own safety and the safety of others, since she's attacked multiple people. So anyway, the preacher at first is disinclined to believe it. He says, at Thornfield? I've never heard of a Mrs. Rochester at Thornfield. And that's this next paragraph there, where Rochester says, no, by God, I took care that none should hear of it, or of her under that name. And so then finally he quits trying to pretend like he's not married, and he says, enough, I'll say it all. Wood, close your book, take off your surplice. So basically tells the preacher there's not going to be a wedding. He tells the clerk to leave the church, and there'll be no wedding. He says, bigamy is an ugly word. I meant, however, to be a bigamist. So basically he admits he does have a wife. His wife is still alive, and he knowingly was going to marry Jane, even though that is against the law, and it's against the rules of the church. He was going to do it anyway. And so he does clear Jane's name. He said she didn't know anything about it. But he says, I did marry Bertha Mason 15 years ago, and she's mad. She came from a mad family. They're all drunks and mad and all that, and I didn't know it till after I married her. And he says, I invite you all to come up to the house and visit Mrs. Poole's patient and my wife, and you'll see, who I'm married to and why I wanted to marry somebody else. And so they head back to the house. That's number 4, where he takes them. He takes them all back to the house. And Mrs. Fairfax, Adele, Sophie, and Leah were, coming out to greet them and tell them congratulations. And he's like, get away! Where are your congratulations? It's 15 years too late. And they go just kind of zooming past. And he takes them all the way up to that bedroom on the 3rd floor where Mason and Jane were that night, where Jane kept having to sponge the blood, and she was worried about somebody coming out from an interior door. And he moves aside the wall hangings, and sure enough, there is a doorway in there, and he opens it up, and it's a little room that has no windows, and is lit only by a small fire. And Grace Poole is in there, and when they look beyond Grace Poole, they see what looks like a creature kind of running back and forth on all fours with long, shaggy hair, really big. And finally, she stands up, on her legs, and you can kind of tell it's a woman, but she looks very, very scary. And so Grace tells him to watch out, and because she's seen him, and sure enough, as soon as Bertha realizes Rochester's in the room, she charges at him and tries to attack him and like bite his cheek and all that. And so Rochester won't hit her, but he's like grappling with her to try to get her in a chair and get her tied down so she can't attack. So he doesn't hit her or push her or anything like that, but he does try to restrain her. And so again, that's how the mystery of Grace Poole is finally solved. She's not crazy. She's not a vampire or trying to kill Rochester or any of that. This is why Rochester would never send her away. She's actually the nurse or the jailer or whatever you want to call it for Bertha Mason. Okay. And that's why she gets, remember the earlier chapter where it talked about how she gets paid so much money? That's why she gets paid so much, because she has to sit up there in that little, room with her. And so anyway, after that, they leave the room, and Mr. Briggs, the lawyer, says that the reason he is there is whenever Jane wrote to her uncle. Do you remember that? After they took the carriage ride into town to get silks for dresses, Jane thought to herself, I'm going to write to my uncle, and then maybe, if he still wants to adopt me, then I won't be so penniless marrying Rochester. Well, when her uncle got the letter, Richard Mason was visiting her uncle. She didn't know it, but they know each other. And he told Richard Mason, hey, this says here that my niece is still alive and she's going to marry this guy named Rochester. Don't you know a Rochester? And so then that's how the whole thing came out. And her uncle realized that his niece was about to enter into, without her knowing it, into a bigamy marriage, where he was already married. So it would not be a legal marriage in the eyes of the law or the eyes of the church. And so he's too ill to travel, so he sends Richard Mason and hires a lawyer in London, that's Mr. Briggs, to go and stop all of it. So that's the role that Jane's uncle played in the proceedings. When she wrote to him about the marriage, he put two and two together because he knows Mason, and that's how he was the one who actually made sure the marriage was stopped so that she didn't get drawn into this trap of bigamy. Okay? And so Mr. Briggs tells her, he said, if your uncle were not so horribly sick, I would tell you to go to him. He said, but I don't know if he would still be alive by the time you could get there. So, she doesn't really have anywhere to go for that. And so, he explains about how, your uncle hired me, blah, 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 blah. And so she goes down to her room and goes in and shuts herself in and takes off her wedding dress and puts back on one of the plain dresses that she normally wears and then sat down. She said, I felt weak and tired. I leaned my arms on a table and my head dropped on them. And now I thought. Till now I had only heard, seen, moved, followed up and down where I was led or dragged, watched event rush on event, disclosure open beyond exclosure. But now I thought. Okay, so now she's like thinking about the whole situation and trying to figure out what she's going to do. And so she's there by herself and is, of course, heartbroken because she realizes that, all of her hopes and dreams that she had had just yesterday and even that morning of being married to the man she loves and having, a wonderful life open up ahead of her, and they were fixing to go travel Europe, and all of that is gone, is just completely gone. It's just ripped away. And she says, I looked at my love, that feeling which was my master's, which he had created. It shivered in my heart like a suffering child in a cold cradle. Sickness and anguish had seized it. It could not seek Mr. Rochester's arms. It could not derive warmth from his breast. Oh, never more could it turn to him, for faith was blighted, confidence was destroyed. Mr. Rochester was not to me what he had been, for he was not what I had thought him, because he lied to her, obviously. So I think that this is interesting, where she describes her love for Rochester as like a sick, crying infant, because remember, that was the dream she kept having. Remember that dream she had? that the night before, not the night before the wedding, but the night before that she was telling Rochester about. She dreamed that she was holding this child, and Rochester was getting further and further away, and she was trying to run after him, and she couldn't. And then in the other dream, she was holding this crying child and was trying to climb Thornfield, but it was a ruin. And when she got to the top, the child moved, and she and the child both fell, and that's what made her wake up, and that's when she saw Bertha in her room. So it's just interesting that now we realize that the child, of course, the dreaming of a child once again means a bad omen, right? We have seen that happen again. The bad omen, of course, being that she was not going to be able to marry Rochester and live happily ever after. But also it's interesting that the child is kind of representative of her love for Rochester. Okay? So then the last question says, what is the only thing that sustains Jane at the end of chapter 26? So what's the only thing that keeps her going? And from just, going into complete despair. She says, she seemed to have laid down in the dried up bed of a great river. She heard a flood loosened and felt the torrent come to rise. She felt faint and wished she was dead. So, she's just horrified. It's the just worst thing she can imagine happening. But she says, only one idea still throbbed lifelike within me, a remembrance of God. It begot an unuttered prayer. These words went wandering up and down in my rayless mind as something that should be whispered, but no energy was found to express them. Be not far from me, for trouble is near. There is none to help, which is from Psalm 22:11. So the one thing that she still has to sustain her is her faith, is God at the end. And so she just, puts her head down and lets the waters flood over her. So just kind of like lets everything just engulf her of everything that she has experienced. So chapter 27 is a couple hours later in that afternoon, and she rises up and looks around and realizes that the biggest question is, what am I going to do? And her mind answers back. You know how you kind of have a conversation in your own mind. And the answer is, leave Thornfield at once. And she's like, no, I don't want to do that. But a voice inside her answered that she could do it and she should do it. The little voice within her that we all know, whether we could refer to it as our conscience or the voice of God or whatever you want to call it, is telling her she's got to leave. She can't stay there and be his mistress or anything like that. She loves him, but he's married, and so she has to leave Thornfield. So she just doesn't see how she's going to do it. I mean, she loves him so completely, and she's been happy at Thornfield for the first time in her life, How is she going to make herself leave? And she says, let me be torn away, let another help me. And the voice says to her, no, you shall tear yourself away, none shall help you. You shall yourself pluck out your right eye, yourself cut off your right hand. Your heart shall be the victim, and you the priest to transfix it. Which is, of course, a reference to the Old Testament in Matthew 5:27-32, where Jesus is sort of redefining the Old Testament concept of adultery, and it's basically talking about if your eye offends you, pluck it out, that kind of thing. So that's what she's referencing there, is that she has to do the job herself, even though it's going to be painful. So finally she realizes she's got to go get something to eat or drink. She hasn't had anything at all that day. She hasn't had anything since like the day before, and she feels very faint because she hasn't had anything to eat or drink. And so she realizes nobody's come to check on her this whole time. Like, not Fairfax, not Adele, not Mr. Rochester, like nobody. And she's like, well, daggone, they just left me up here, And but when she finally goes outside the room, she realizes why. She said, I stumbled over an obstacle. My head was still dizzy and my sight were dim. I could not soon recover myself. I fell, but not onto the ground. An outstretched arm caught me. I looked up. I was supported by Mr. Rochester, who sat in a chair across my chamber threshold. So that's why nobody's been to see her. He's been there the whole time, sitting outside of her room. He wouldn't let anybody in. So he's been waiting on her to come out. And so he says, what have you been doing in there? I haven't heard a word. I haven't heard you crying. what's going on. And then he tells her, Jane, I never meant to wound you thus. If the man had but one little lamb that was as dear to him as a daughter, and he accidentally sent it to be slaughtered, he said, he wouldn't rue his bloody blunder more than I now rue mine. Will you ever forgive me? And so that's that first question. She says, Reader, I forgave him at the moment and on the spot. There was so much remorse in his whole, attitude. She knew he was sorry. She knew he never meant to do it to hurt her. He just, wanted to marry her. So she did forgive him. So anyway, running out of time. So, she goes down to the library, takes her down there and gets her some wine and something to eat, puts her near the fire to try to revive her. And at first, what he's talking about the two of them doing, he says, we'll just leave. We'll go away. We'll go live somewhere in like Italy or France or something where nobody knows us. And we'll just tell everybody we're husband and wife. And so that's how he envisions a happy ending. We'll go off. We'll introduce ourselves as husband and wife. I mean, who's going to question us? I mean, that's true. If somebody new moves to town and they tell you they're husband and wife, you don't say, let me see your birth certificate. Let me see your wedding certificate. So he's right. They could do that. But Jane refuses. Why does she refuse? Well, because it's wrong. He's married. That goes against the church. It goes against God. You can't have another wife or husband while you're married to somebody else. And so he finally goes into explaining, because she feels bad for Bertha. She's like, you shouldn't, talk so badly about her. She can't help being crazy. And he's like, no. It's not because she's crazy. He said, if you were to go crazy, I would still care for you. I wouldn't hire somebody to take care of you. I'd take care of you. I would still love you just as much, even if you were insane and didn't know who I was. He said, I didn't like her before she went crazy. And so then he goes into the whole story. And we also find out now about why he had falling out with his brother and his father. Because the whole marriage to Bertha was a trick. Okay, so I want to make sure you understood what happened there. Rochester was the younger son. His older brother was set to inherit the estate. And the way the rules of entailment go in England, the oldest son inherits everything. And then all the other, the girls, of course, would get married, but all the other children have to find something else to do because they're not going to inherit the estate. So the dad didn't want to split up the estate, but he also didn't want his younger son to live, the life of a pauper. He wanted him to have a whole bunch of money. So he found out through a friend of his, the older Mr. Mason, who's already dead now, that his daughter was basically on the marriage market and that she came with a dowry of £30,000. Now remember, Jane was supposed to get, for a full year of being a governess, £30. Okay? So this is £30,000. So it's basically like 1,000 years worth of Jane's salary. That's how much of a dowry this chick came with. So they didn't mention anything about the money to Rochester. That was their plan, his brother and his dad. They just talked about how beautiful she was and all of that. And she was this big, dark beauty. She was very tall, very buxom, so, like curvy, thick, I guess we would say in today's time. And really like dark skin, dark eyes, dark hair, because remember her mom was Creole. So she's got that exotic beauty, kind of like the way they described Blanche, which now we also understand why there's no way he ever would have married Blanche. She reminded him too much of Bertha. But anyway, so he met her at parties, but they never let them be alone together. And it was a real whirlwind romance. And she was so beautiful and everybody, liked her and was jealous of him for having something to do with her. And so he was married almost before he knew it. And so after they got married, he realized that she was a drunk. She was really hot-headed. They couldn't keep servants. She was constantly screaming at servants and getting drunk, calling Rochester everything under the sun and sleeping with everybody. He doesn't come straight out and say it, but in the words he alludes to, you realize that's what's going on, because he said some of her vices led her insanity to happen faster. And so other stuff he mentions too, we basically are supposed to understand that her sleeping around led to her getting STDs, and one of them, syphilis can make you go crazy. And so that hastened her descent into madness, along with the fact that it ran in her family. because her mom was locked up in an asylum. So anyway, he was having a miserable time of it and actually took out guns one night and was going to kill himself whenever there was this fresh breeze that came across the ocean and seemed like England. And he was like, I know what I'll do. I'll go there, drop her at Thornfield, lock her up, have her taken care of. And he couldn't divorce her because by this time the doctors had pronounced her insane. And so I think there's stuff around that now, but in that time period, you could not create or dissolve any kind of contract, like a marriage contract or anything else, will, anything, unless you were in sound mind. And so since she's crazy, he can't divorce her. That's the whole thing. Married for in sickness and in health, right? So he takes her back to England, dumps her. He goes and has multiple affairs across. He has one in Germany, one in Italy. We already know about the one in France. But he doesn't really like any of these women long term, and he's miserable. He can't find what he really wants, which is somebody who he can love, like a soulmate. So then he comes back to Thornfield, and that's, of course, when he meets Jane. And so he starts talking again about meeting her and how she intrigued him. And she's like, no, please stop. I can't hear this, because she still loves him. But also, as he was talking about his mistresses, Jane, and he talked about how having a mistress was almost like hiring a slave, like it was degrading. And she said she felt the truth of those words, and she knows that she never needs to let herself be swayed and taken into that position of being his mistress, which is basically what she would be, even if they moved someplace else and introduced themselves as husband and wife. Legally and in the eyes of God, she would still be his mistress. So then he tries to convince her, but he realizes that she is not going to be swayed. He looks in her eyes, and she's just determined that she's leaving. And he's like, how can you do this? It wouldn't be wrong to love me. I love you. If you leave me, I'll be full of despair. And, all I want to do is make your life better. And you make my life better. And, how can you call that woman my wife? She's not even a human practically. I'm just stuck with her. And Jane's like, no, we have to do the right thing. And so he starts crying, and she goes back and tries to comfort him, but then he's like, no, you're going to stay with me, and she goes running out of the room. And so she goes up there and goes to sleep, and then is woken up in the middle of the night by the moonlight. It strikes, over her bed. It's a beautiful moon, and it almost seems like there's a white human form in the moon gazing on her. And it seems like there's words whispered in her heart, my daughter, flee temptation. And she says, Mother, I will. So it's almost like the spirit of her mom is what she feels like has visited her and tells her to flee temptation. Like, don't be tempted into doing what you know is a sin. You have to leave. And so she does. She gets her little stuff together. She doesn't have much, only 20 shillings and a little bit of, clothing and stuff. Gets some food. And as she's walking past each of their doors, she hears Rochester pacing back and forth in his, even though it's probably like 4 or 5 in the morning. And so she has to be really quiet. And she is so tempted. Like, she's passing past his door, and she's like, I could just turn that doorknob and go in and tell him I'll be his, and we could run away together, and life would be so happy. But she knows it's not right, and so she has to make herself keep going. And so she leaves Thornfield, and it's so hard. It's so hard for her to do it. She falls, and for a while just can't even get up, make herself get up. And then she finally makes herself get up and keeps going. And she eventually gets to the road and sees a coach coming. And she asks where he's going, and he says a long way off, and she knows it's not anywhere that Rochester has friends. And she says, how much would you charge me to go there? He said, it's 30 shillings. And she said, well, I've only got 20. And so he said he'd try to make it do. So she got inside and rolled away. And she said, gentle reader, may you never feel what I then felt. May your eyes never shed such stormy, scalding, heart-wrung tears. May you never appeal to heaven in prayer so hopeless. For never may you, like me, dread to be the instrument of evil to what you wholly love. Because not only is she incredibly sad for herself, because she loves him and she's having to leave the man she loves, but she's really worried about what he's going to do. Will he kill himself? Will he, go back to Europe and get more mistresses and, therefore live a life where she won't even, her only hope now, and she told him this, is that maybe they can one day meet in heaven. All right, so that's the end of that chapter. I'm going to send you, and it'll be on the portal, the directions for what you're going to do for the written response. Please make it a page.